Oh, hey guys, you're just in time. I'm just starting to get this transmission caught up to that small block we put together last week. I'm gonna clean it up a bit and give it a good rattle can coat of red. We got a new gear lever to put on here. We'll go over wiring up this lockup converter, dipstick, speedo gear, throttle valve cable, put the tail shaft housing on, and the cooler lines. First things first, let's get that old gear shifter, arm, lever, selector, whatever off. Before I get much further, I want to make a note of the number that's on this pump. Pretty sure I can get manufacturer year info off of that number. I'm going to find one on the transmission too before we paint it. Always a good idea to just have those numbers. So this is a 700 R4 from a 1983 something. And later on, when the paint's drying, maybe we can find out what this thing came out of. I went ahead and painted the bottom, flipped it over, and now we can continue on the top. As you can see, I'm not super concerned about this. You're never gonna see it. It doesn't even really need paint. So I'm just doing this Rust-Oleum farm and implement paint. We'll get some tape where we don't want paint quick. Is it dry? Yup. So I ended up doing another coat because this Ford red was way too dark and way too orange. But this Troy-Bilt red, it's actually not that far off from that Viper red that I painted the engine block. So I gave it a coat of that. I want to get this thing unmasked and start putting it together. I think we'll start off with this gear selector arm. So this dude here goes on the original gear selector shaft. It bolts onto that shaft through this bushing, so it's totally clockable. You can move this anywhere you need to. So we're gonna go ahead and bolt this bushing to that shaft. Comes with this nut with a collar on it. I'm gonna put a dab of Loctite in there. All right, now that the bushing's on there, we gotta put the arm on. So it's splined like that bushing, so we can go on wherever I want to, and then I just tighten it up with that set screw. It's gonna take some messing around to get this thing to shift properly. So for now, I'm gonna kind of guess where this is gonna need to be. I'm gonna have a rod coming off of the column that's gonna rotate this around. So I'm gonna put this thing on at about 10 o'clock with the set screw down, so that way when all this is in the truck, I can adjust this by getting underneath, taking that set screw out, and moving this around. This is a nice looking dipstick. Let's throw it in there. I'm normally not a fan of these aftermarket ones, but if we clean it up real nice, we get a good seal, it'll be all right. So this dipstick tube actually has double O-rings, which is awesome, but I'm gonna go ahead and put a little bit of RTV on it too. I think I need an RTV sponsor. Just gonna take a zip tie and make sure that doesn't move while it dries. Let's get these cooler lines on next. Some people say don't use Teflon tape, they don't like it, but I have never had an issue with it, as long as you're putting it on right. If you're looking at your threads like this, start your Teflon tape going clockwise. Wrap it around a bunch of times, and when you're done and you rip that off, that end of that Teflon tape, when you go to thread this into that hole, it's gonna get pulled away, and that's how you want that. These lines have one end with a right angle on it and one that's straight. I don't know what I'm doing for trans cooler yet or where it's gonna be, but what I do know is that I don't have a whole lot of room in this transmission tunnel. So I'm gonna put the right angle end on the transmission just to give me extra room. Alright, I'm gonna label these because it does matter where they go. It'll work either way, but the return should go in the top port. We are making some progress here. Let's get this TV cable installed. So kind of like a kickdown cable for like a Turbo 350, but not the same at all. Turbo 350, for instance, the kickdown cable will downshift that transmission when you smash the gas. This 700R4 has a throttle valve cable. It's basically monitoring your throttle position the entire time. And if it's not set up properly, you can burn up this transmission real quick. That, however, is a video for another day, because we're gonna have to deal with that when we get up to the carburetor and we have to connect this there. For today, we're just gonna put the throttle valve cable on the little springer dude. Got some O-rings, nice new stainless bolt, a retaining clip. This is kind of dumb though. The retaining clip's got to go down here, and in order to get it down there, I got to put it along this whole thing, which means I got to take all this apart. Put a little transmission fluid on those O-rings to help it slide in there. So this end of the TV cable, there's a little hole in it. Here's our little hook. I think you can figure out what we're about to do. Yep, you guessed it. We're gonna hook the hole. VIN maybe? I've been waiting for some parts to finish this up, like the right parts. So it's probably a good time to go over how we wire up this lockup. By the way, when you're ordering Speedo gears, don't get online and look up Speedo gear. Spill out speedometer. I wasn't looking to buy what Google thought I was trying to say. These pigtail harnesses are available everywhere online, and they're super cheap too, like $7-8 bucks. I actually made my own once with a weather pack plug. I just had to cut slits in these. There. It worked, but for $7-8, kind of a waste of time. So pin A, this violet one here, is the only one that I really need. It just needs an ignition source. That allows it to lock up fourth gear. The problem with that is when it's locked up, it needs to deactivate somehow. Otherwise, when you come to a stop, the engine's gonna die. So what I do is interrupt that ignition source with a relay through the brake switch. So when I'm cruising along and I have to slow down, when I put my foot on the brake, it'll disengage that fourth gear lockup and I can come to a stop. Welcome to LT's wonderful world of relays. Just kidding, we ain't going there. We could talk for hours about what these little things can do. Today, we're just worried about unlocking that torque converter. We're gonna look at this relay like this. The terminals on this relay are labeled on the relay as follows: 85, 86, 87, 87A, and 30. Think of it like a switch. You got something going in, you got something going out, and you got something to make that happen. In order to make that happen, 85 and 86 need to see opposite polarities, meaning there's 12 volts on one and ground on the other. That's gonna flip the switch. In this case, we're putting ground on 85 and our brake signal on 86. So 87 and 30 is what you call normally open. That means there's no connection until that switch flips. And then 87 and 30 are connected. 87A and 30, what you call normally closed. Meaning until that switch flips, those are connected. Switch flips, they're not connected. So since we're trying to take ignition away from this purple wire to unlock that torque converter, we're gonna leave 87 open. We're not gonna use it. 87A is gonna go to our keyed 12 volt ignition. So that leaves 30. 30 is gonna be our output to our transmission plug, violet wire, pin A. The other 3 pins we're not using. So since 87A and 30 are a normally closed circuit, that means when we turn the ignition on, that's gonna put power to that pigtail on the transmission, allowing that to lock up fourth gear when it's ready. And since there's ground on 85, when we step on the brake, that relay flips, and 87A and 30 are no longer connected, which means there is not 12 volts on the transmission, which will unlock the torque converter. Let's go extend these wires and make them a little more manageable. Somehow these wires got pinched. We're gonna wanna cut them short of that spot. We're only using one of those wires, but I'm gonna extend them all, so that way they all go into the cab and they're all right there in the kick panel or wherever they end up being. I'll just know that they're all there if I ever need them. Brown wire, blue wire, and our hero of the day, violet. Also have a soldering iron, solder, and heat shrink. So solder will flow towards the heat, and heat rises, so I'm gonna hold the soldering iron on the underside of that wire and apply the solder from the top, so that way it'll flow down to the heat source, our soldering iron. Shrinking this heat shrink, you can use a heat gun, you can use a lighter, you can take the tip off your soldering iron and use the flame from that. I could do any one of them, but I already have the soldering iron and it's got that vent and it's hot. All right, we got these extended. Now we need to make them manageable so we can run them inside without making a big tangled up mess. I'm gonna put this in the vise, but I'm really not gonna pinch it too hard. Just enough to hold them. Cut them all at the same length. All right, once I get that wound up, I can't just let that go, otherwise it'll tangle up and end up in a big twisted up ball of frustration. So what I do is put it in reverse and back it up a little bit and then take it off. And just like that, easy to manage and in its own bundle, so I know exactly where this came from. I'm gonna use this outdoor tester tape and tape up just about the first foot or so, because this wire is gonna have to meet up with another one that we'll get to in a minute, and then they'll be taped together and run into the inside of the truck. All right, so we got that ready to go. Now we got to move on to putting that speedometer gear in. All right, we're in park now. We got to get it in neutral so we can turn that shaft. I did end up reclocking this to more like 8 o'clock. It's just gonna work better for our application. So we're in park, reverse, neutral. So the reason I had to put that in neutral, because we got to turn this shaft until those holes are on the top there. So the reason we need those holes is because they hold this clip, which holds the speedometer gear on. I should get some curtains. This part of the clip here is gonna go in the hole closest to the front of the truck. This gear here is known as the drive gear, and it's just gonna slide on the output shaft over this clip. So this gear here is known as the driven gear. It gets turned by that drive gear that we just installed. Different combinations of the drive gear and the driven gear will give you a different outcome at your odometer. So if you need to correct your odometer because of tire size or rear end gears or anything like that, you can do it just by changing either one or both of these out. In my case, it doesn't even matter because my speedometer calibrates with a button. Press it once, drive a mile, press it again, and it automatically knows. This output shaft housing has an O-ring on it, so I clean that up, make sure it seals good. So now that we got the right tail shaft extension housing with the big hole, we're gonna put a little transmission fluid on the O-ring, make sure it goes in nice and seals up. These bolts are 10 millimeter and 1.5 pitch thread. Everything on this transmission is metric. So these have a 15 mil head on them. So now our driven gear and housing get put in that hole. There's an O-ring around this too. No, I don't put RTV on this stuff. The only thing on these transmissions that I've had an issue with is the aftermarket dipsticks. Now we got this C-clip clamp bracket, this thing. 10 mil bolt, 11. So this is an adapter. It'll take that analog mechanical signal and turns it into a digital pulses per mile that my new odometer can read. It just goes on there like your cable would. Snap the harness on. So this is the wire that I was talking about the lockup wires meeting up with. So we're gonna run these up over the top of the transmission. So we're gonna pop it up somewhere in the transmission tunnel before the firewall because we wanna keep everything clean. I don't wanna run this out in the firewall and you see where it comes through. We'll probably run it up, pop it up into the cab right about there. One thing you always do when you're dealing with wires is leave yourself a service loop. Leave enough slack on this where you can unplug that, and pull enough back where you can service it. Putting a zip tie on it through this hole will ensure that I maintain that service loop. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. Next time we'll be back under there. I'll see you then.